slap echoed through our Thanksgiving dinner so hard the entire room went dead silent. My fork slipped from my fingers. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Then my father stood up and did something I never saw coming. He pointed straight at the door. "Get the hell out of my house." Not at my sister, the one who had just slapped me across the face in front of the entire family. At me. I stood there, cheek still burning, and slowly looked at every face around that table. My mother stared down at her plate. My sister smiled with satisfaction. Not a single pair of eyes would meet mine. I nodded, put on my coat, and walked out into the cold. What they didn't know was that in less than 12 hours, everything they thought they owned would no longer be theirs. Because the biggest secret in my family was never about the money. It was about who actually owned all of it. My name is Maya Donovan. 20 years as a U.S. Army logistics officer. 2 overseas deployments. Fort Carson, Colorado, and assignments I'm still not permitted to discuss in detail. And this is the story of how my family threw me out into a Denver winter and why, 12 hours later, they woke up with absolutely nothing to show for it. I want to be honest with you before we go any further. I've thought about whether to tell this story publicly, and the reason I almost didn't isn't shame. It's something more complicated. It's the fact that telling it requires me to admit something I spent 2 decades refusing to see. I spent 20 years of my life confusing sacrifice with love. I kept giving and telling myself that generosity was its own reward, that my family would eventually understand what I'd been doing for them, that gratitude would arrive eventually if I was just patient enough. If that sounds familiar, if you've ever poured yourself into people who absorbed everything you gave and called it their due, then stay with me. This one's for you. For almost 15 of my 20 years in the Army, I had been quietly, invisibly, systematically keeping my entire family financially solvent. Let me tell you how that started. I was 26, 3 years into my career. My father made what I can only describe as a catastrophic financial decision. I won't go into the specific details because they reflect badly on him and they're not the point, but the short version is that he trusted the wrong person with money he didn't truly have, and within 6 months, my parents were staring down the loss of the house I grew up in, a 3-bedroom colonial in a suburb north of Denver that had been in the family since before I was born. I stepped in, quietly, without announcement. I called an attorney named Nathan Graves, restructured the financing, placed the property deed in my name, and began covering the mortgage, the property taxes, the insurance, and every major repair that followed. The roof replacement 3 years later. Mine. The furnace the winter after that. Mine. The foundation issue that emerged while I was deployed overseas and had to be handled entirely by phone. Mine. Every single time, handled professionally, paid promptly, documented carefully. My family lived in the house. My name held the house. The 2 facts coexisted without anyone asking how. I also purchased 2 vehicles, one for my father, one for my mother. Both registered under my name. Both insured under my name. I handed them the keys one Sunday afternoon, said use them as long as you need, and received thank yous that evaporated within the year. Funny how quickly gifts transform into entitlements when nobody keeps the ledger visible. My sister Cassie had a different kind of dependency. She wasn't interested in houses or cars. She was interested in the unspoken assumption that someone would always catch her. I covered 2 semesters of a college program she eventually abandoned. I put down the deposit on her first apartment, then her second after the first landlord asked her to leave. I paid off a credit card balance that had been quietly metastasizing, while she changed jobs every 8 months, always citing management issues or scheduling conflicts or the fundamental unfairness of wherever she happened to be working. Each time, she thanked me with the casual ease of someone who has never genuinely worried about money because they have never needed to. I told myself I was being a good sister. What I was actually being was a system that enabled her to never grow up. The years passed. I deployed. I came home. I missed Christmases and birthdays and ordinary Sunday dinners that other families take completely for granted. I built a military career that looked excellent from the outside and felt quietly hollow in the evenings, because somewhere deep in my chest I had built my whole sense of purpose around providing for people who had stopped thinking of what I gave them as provision. It had just become air, invisible, expected, there when you needed it, never thought about when you didn't. My sister Cassie had always been the favorite. There was no point pretending otherwise. Growing up, if Cassie forgot a responsibility, someone fixed it for her. If she made a bad decision, Someone smoothed it over. If she hurt someone? An explanation appeared like clockwork. She's just spirited. She doesn't mean it that way. You know how she is. Everyone accommodated her because she expected accommodation the way some people expect weather. It was simply part of the environment. I was the reliable one. The steady one. The one nobody worried about. Being the reliable one sounds like a compliment. It isn't. It's just a polite way of saying, we don't need to pay attention to you because you don't demand it. And the moment you stop demanding, you become furniture. Essential, functional, and completely invisible. Thanksgiving arrived on a freezing Thursday. I had driven 4 hours south from Fort Carson with a few days of leave, and a cautious, deliberately contained hope that this year would be different. The house looked genuinely beautiful, warm light in every window. The smell of roasting turkey drifting out through the cold air as I stood on the porch. For about 30 minutes after I sat down, everything actually worked. Football murmuring from the living room, food everywhere. Even Cassie seemed subdued. Then someone mentioned that a mutual friend had just gotten engaged. Cassie turned to me. She had a particular smile she deployed in these situations, something between warmth and a scalpel. So, Maya. She lifted her wine glass. Still single? I shrugged. Still happy. A couple of people laughed. Cassie didn't. You know, she continued, tilting her head in that theatrical way she'd spent 30-something years perfecting. At a certain point in life, being happy alone isn't really the flex you think it is. The table got quieter. I kept my voice completely even. Works for me. Does it, or is it just easier than admitting that spending your whole life playing soldier makes you kind of impossible to be around? Honestly, and I want to stop here, because this matters. If I were watching this happen to someone I loved, I would have intervened. I would have said something. But I had spent 2 decades learning that the calmest person in the room controls the room, and so I did the thing that Cassie had always found most infuriating. I reached for my water glass. I was unbothered. That, as it turned out, was the unforgivable offense. Cassie couldn't tolerate stillness. She needed reaction the way fire needs oxygen. My calm was a rejection of everything she was performing. She stood so fast her chair scraped across the hardwood floor. You always act like everyone in this room is beneath you. I don't. Stop looking at me like that. I'm just looking at you, Cassie. And then she hit me. The slap came without any warning and with extraordinary force. I heard the sound before I felt it, a sharp crack that traveled through every room in that house. My head snapped sideways. The sting bloomed across my cheekbone and radiated outward. I remember hearing the kitchen clock ticking, the distant football broadcast, my own breathing, slower than it had any right to be. I waited, completely still, for someone to speak. No one said a word. I looked at my mother. She was studying the tablecloth with intense, deliberate focus. I looked at my uncle at the far end of the table. He looked at his plate. I looked at my father. He had risen from his chair. And for one single, shattering second, I want you to understand what this felt like. I believed he was finally going to stand up for me. 20 years of sacrifice compressed into one naive, desperate second of hope. He was not standing up for me. He pointed at the front door. Get out. Quiet. Almost controlled. Get out of my house, Maya. Tonight. Dad, I've had enough of your attitude coming into this home and making everyone uncomfortable. My attitude. Not the slap. Not his other daughter standing across the table with red still flush on her palm. My attitude. Don't ever come back, he said. Then he sat down and picked up his fork. My mother did not move. Cassie folded her arms and a small, unmistakable smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. The clock ticked. The television murmured. And I stood there in a room full of people and felt more alone than I ever had on any deployment, in any tent, in any country where nobody knew my name. Then I picked up my coat. I walked to the front door. And I walked out into the Colorado winter. I sat in my truck for a very long time, not crying, not shaking. There's a specific kind of stillness that comes in. The seconds after a decision becomes inevitable, a soldier learns to recognize it. This felt like that, like standing at the edge of something that cannot be walked back from. I pulled out my phone. I opened my laptop. I logged into a secure file folder I had been maintaining, carefully and quietly, for nearly 15 years. Property deed. My name at the top. Mortgage records. My name on every line. Vehicle registrations. Both of them. My name. Insurance policies. trust documents, emergency account records, every asset, every signature, every dollar trail. A complete legal picture of a life I had built for other people to live in. I had never planned to use any of it this way. But there is a moment in every person's life, and I think most of you know the moment. I mean, when the cost of absorbing someone else's cruelty finally exceeds what you are willing to pay. Not what you can pay, what you are willing to. I had just reached mine. I called Nathan. He answered on the second ring. Nathan Graves had represented me for over 12 years, and what made him invaluable was not drama or aggression. It was his utter absence of both. He listened without interrupting while I told him everything, the slap, the ejection, my mother's silence, the smirk on Cassie's face. When I finished, there was a long pause on the line. Are you absolutely certain? I knew what he meant. Not whether the events had happened. Whether I was finally ready to stop protecting people who had spent years taking everything I offered and giving nothing back. I looked back at the house through the windshield. Warm light behind the curtains. My family, in there somewhere, probably already finishing dessert, probably already recalibrating the story into something more comfortable, probably already convinced I would cool down, that I would call tomorrow. That I always called. Start first thing in the morning, I said. Everything. He exhaled. Then we start. I barely slept. Not from distress, from a strange, unfamiliar clarity that arrives when a long and complicated decision finally simplifies itself. For years I had been telling myself a story about my family, that things would change, that gratitude would arrive eventually, that my father would one day say thank you, that Cassie would grow up, that my mother's silence was not the same as choosing sides. I had told myself this story the way you tell yourself the ice is thick enough while you keep walking. The ice was not thick enough. It had never been thick enough. I had just refused to look down. By 8 the following morning, Nathan's office had begun transmitting documents. Not emotional messages, not threats. Clean, precise, legally airtight notices. Property ownership confirmation. Termination of occupancy agreement. Vehicle usage revocation. Insurance cessation, timed per contract. Every action prepared years in advance. Every step compliant with state law. No shortcuts. No loopholes. No revenge, just ownership rights, exercised. My father called at 8:14. No greeting. What the hell is this? I was sitting in a diner off the highway, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, watching snow fall across an empty parking lot. Which notice specifically? The house. The notice about the house. The ownership confirmation? Silence. His breathing, audible. Then, you cannot do this. I can. This is our home. I want to pause here and be honest with you for a moment, because this is the part of the story I think about most. When he said our home, there was something in his voice. Not performance, not manipulation, genuine belief. He truly had convinced himself, over 15 years, that the house was his, not through dishonesty, through willful blindness, through the human capacity to accept comfort without examining its source. He believed it because believing it required nothing from him. Examining it would have required everything. It's my home, I said. It has been for 15 years. Silence. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then the pivot came, the one I recognized from a lifetime of watching him operate. When accountability appears, he reached for offense. You're overreacting. It was one argument. I closed my eyes. There is something almost surgical about the way people minimize cruelty the moment consequences begin. One argument. One slap. One night. As if the final event is the only event. As if everything before it didn't happen, didn't accumulate, didn't eventually fill up past capacity. It was not one argument, I said. It was 18 years. His breathing grew heavier. I could picture him in the kitchen, pacing, searching for the framing that would restore his position. Then he said it. 5 words that crystallized our entire relationship. Not just what had happened at Thanksgiving, but every year that preceded it. 5 words that I will remember for the rest of my life. You owe this family. I want to stop the story here because I need you to really hear that. Not thank you. Not, I appreciate what you've done. Not, we should have said this years ago. You owe this family. As if 15 years of mortgage payments were a debt I carried rather than gifts I gave freely. As if every repair bill, every tuition payment, every deposit on Cassie's apartments, every vehicle title in my name, as if all of it had just been the minimum required of me. the baseline expectation, the entry fee for belonging. If you have ever spent years giving everything you had to people who looked at your generosity and called it obligation, if you have ever been the invisible one, the reliable one, the one who sacrifices in silence and receives silence in return, then you know exactly what those 5 words felt like. It wasn't ingratitude, it was erasure. The complete collapse of the distinction between a person who gives and a machine that produces. No, I said, I don't. And I hung up. The calls continued all morning. Cassie's number lit up my screen 5 times before noon. Everyone went unanswered. Her text swung between theatrical disbelief and accusations of drama, which struck me as a particularly precise form of irony from the woman who had physically struck me across the face at a family dinner. My mother called in the early afternoon. Her voice was different from my father's. Not furious, not performative, frightened, and underneath the fear, something quieter. Something like the beginning of comprehension. The house, Maya. Your father says, the house belongs to me, Mom. It's been that way since I was 26 years old. A pause. You never told us. I chose my next words carefully, because this needed to be honest and not cruel. I told you every time documents needed to be signed, when the mortgage was restructured, when the insurance policies were renewed, when the tax forms arrived. A beat. You chose not to pay attention, and I let you, because I didn't want gratitude. I just wanted you to be safe. The silence that followed lasted a long time. When she finally spoke, it was barely 2 words. Oh, Maya. Not defensive. Not angry. Just landed. Like someone who has stepped off a train and is finally looking at where they are. Both vehicles were gone within 3 days. My father's SUV, the one he had driven for nearly 8 years, and referred to routinely as his, was collected by a transport service on a Tuesday morning. Legally, professionally, exactly as outlined in the paperwork. He stood in the driveway and screamed while the neighbors watched from their windows. I heard about this secondhand and found no satisfaction in it. Just a dull, heavy sadness for a man who had spent so long performing a version of himself that he had forgotten the performance wasn't real. My mother's sedan went the following afternoon, she cried. That one hit me harder than his screaming, because my mother was never cruel. She wasn't malicious or aggressive. Her failure was silence, a particular kind of cowardice that masquerades as neutrality, the willingness to watch wrong things happen and convince yourself that not intervening keeps your hands clean. It doesn't. Silence is a choice, like any other choice. But she wasn't evil. And watching her lose something because she'd spent 50 years too afraid to speak, that wasn't satisfying. That was just grief. The financial safety nets disappeared next. The emergency household account I'd maintained for years gone. The supplemental insurance coverage gone. The invisible financial floor that had cushioned my family's existence for 15 years became visible only in its absence. The way you only notice air when it's suddenly not there. The relatives started calling within days. Aunts and uncles and my cousin Dana, who had always treated me fairly but apparently felt obligated to perform as family ambassador. Every conversation followed the same script. You've made your point. They're still your family. You only get one father. Not one person. Not one called to ask how my cheekbone was. Not one person asked what it had felt like to be ejected from a house I'd been paying for, in the dark, in 20-degree weather, while my sister watched with a smile. You only get one father, they said. Nobody ever said, you only get one daughter. Cassie showed up at my apartment on a Saturday. I heard the bell and opened the door, and for a moment I barely recognized her, not because she looked different physically, but because the confidence was gone. All of it. Gone was the casual superiority, the performative ease, the certainty that she occupied the center of every room she entered. What stood on my porch looked smaller, younger, genuinely scared. She pushed past me before I could speak. Classic Cassie. Boundaries had never been her strength. She walked into my living room, turned around and said, "You have completely lost your mind. Good morning. You're destroying Mom and Dad." I folded my arms. I'm allowing consequences to exist. That's a different thing. It was one slap. Maya. I stared at her. She heard what she'd said the moment it left her mouth. I watched the realization move across her face, and still, even then, she didn't apologize. She redirected, which told me exactly where we were. I kept my voice completely level. 2 deployments will teach you this if nothing else. The calmest person controls the room. And Cassie had always despised my stillness. What number would have been sufficient? I asked. How many slaps constitutes a response? How many years? Her mouth opened, closed. Nothing came out. On my coffee table, Nathan had left copies of various documents from our last meeting, and I hadn't filed them away yet. Cassie's eyes found them. She picked up one page slowly, then another. Her face went pale. Tuition receipts. Her name? Her semesters? My account number. Apartment deposits. Her name. My account. Credit card settlements. Her name. My transfers. I watched her flip through them the way someone reads a journal they wrote and forgot recognizing the handwriting. Struggling to recognize the author. Every piece of stability she had attributed to luck, to her parents, to the general goodwill of the universe, it had come from me. Not from their parents, who couldn't have provided it. From me. She sat down heavily on my couch. I thought Mom and Dad, they couldn't afford to. She looked up. Her eyes were filling. What I said next came from somewhere tired and completely honest, not from anger. Cassie, I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because I finally decided to stop being invisible in my own life. That's all this is. She began to cry, not the controlled, deployable crying I'd watched her use strategically for years. Real crying. The kind that surprises the person doing it full body, unguarded. The kind that means something has genuinely landed. Years of reality arriving all at once, through a stack of documents on a coffee table. I watched her and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not vindication, grief. Because the sister I'd spent my whole life wishing for honest, accountable, real, had apparently been in there somewhere the whole time. She'd just been buried under decades of being told she didn't have to show up. She left without resolution. But she left differently than she'd arrived. The cafe meeting came 10 days later. My mother texted asking to meet for coffee. Just us, she wrote. When I arrived at Copper Spoon, a small, warm place on the edge of an older neighborhood, all wooden booths, and the smell of cinnamon and dark roast, all three of them were sitting at a corner table. My mother, my father, Cassie. I had expected this. I sat down without comment. I placed Nathan's folder on the table, and then, without speaking, I began laying documents down one by one. The deed. Tax records covering 15 years. Repair invoices. Mortgage history. Vehicle registrations. Insurance policies. Tuition receipts. Apartment deposits. Emergency account records. The pile grew. The silence grew heavier with every page. My mother picked up one of the roof invoices. Her hands were trembling slightly. She turned to the next page. The furnace. The foundation. 15 years of tax payments. Year after year after year. The same account number. The same signature. I watched her face move through something that wasn't surprise she had known. Vaguely, abstractly. The way people know things they've declined to examine. But she had never seen numbers. Real numbers. In black ink. Accumulating across a decade and a half. These are all from you. Her voice was nearly inaudible. Yes. She turned another page. And another. She looked at Cassie. Cassie was staring at the table. I looked at each of them in turn. Then I said the thing I had been carrying for the better part of 2 decades. The thing I had rehearsed in my head during long nights overseas, and during drives back from the base, and during holidays. I spent alone because I had spent the money on their house instead of a plane ticket home. The money was never the point. I could have lost every dollar and found a way to be fine. What costs me something still is that none of you ever cared enough to ask where it was coming from. Nobody moved. Do you know how many birthdays I spent in a different country? I looked at Cassie. She looked down. Do you know how many times I didn't push back on something that hurt me because I didn't want to upset the equilibrium? I looked at my mother. Tears were moving down her face. Do you know how many times I wired money home instead of spending it on myself? Not because you would have fallen apart without it, but because I was terrified that if I stopped, you would stop needing me. And if you stopped needing me, I wouldn't know what I was for? The table was absolutely still. That last part surprised even me. I hadn't planned to say it, but it was the truest thing I'd said in that room in years, maybe ever. Because the real secret underneath all the sacrifice, underneath all the giving, was this. I had been buying my place in my own family. I had convinced myself that my value was transactional. That love had to be earned through provision because it had never simply been given. My mother wiped her face with the back of her hand. I didn't know, she said. And it wasn't an excuse. I could hear the difference. It was an admission. The specific, heavy admission of someone who chose, repeatedly, not to look and who now understood the cost of that choice. Then my father spoke. And somehow, impossibly, even then, he made it worse. You still shouldn't have done this. My mother closed her eyes. Cassie flinched. I simply looked at him. After the documents, after his wife's tears, after everything laid out in plain language in front of him. Still the same sentence, in a different order. Your response is the problem. I am not the problem. He stood. The chair scraped the floor. He walked toward the door without another word. And the small bell above the entrance rang softly behind him. And he was gone. The three of us sat in the silence he left. Then Cassie looked up. All the armor was gone. What remained looked younger and smaller and more genuinely herself than I had seen in years. I'm sorry, Maya. A single tear moved down her cheek. I didn't know. I genuinely didn't know. I believed her. Not because she'd earned immediate forgiveness, because for the first time, she sounded entirely real. My mother reached across the table as though she was afraid I might pull away. I'm sorry, too. We walked out together into the February cold. My mother hugged me before getting into a borrowed car. Cassie hesitated, then hugged me as well quickly, like she wasn't sure she'd earned the gesture but couldn't not make it. Neither moment erased what had happened. But both felt like something beginning, rather than something ending. Winter became spring slowly that year. By April, Cassie had a full-time job, the first real one she'd held without quitting within the month. When she told me about it one evening on the phone, she sounded almost embarrassed. My feet hurt, she said. I laughed. She laughed. Then she said quietly, I should have been doing this years ago. She was right, but people grow at different speeds. What matters isn't when the lesson arrives, it's whether it does. My mother started calling without agenda, just to talk. To tell me about her week, to ask about mine, to have the kind of ordinary conversation that other mothers and daughters have been having our entire lives. One evening she said something I've returned to many times since. I spent so many years trying to keep the peace that I forgot. Peace and silence aren't the same thing. They aren't. Silence had been the most expensive thing in our family for 20 years. None of us had understood what we were paying for it until the bill finally arrived. My father took longer. He always did. Through March and most of April, I heard updates through relatives still angry, still assigning blame to everyone but himself, still constructing the version of events in which he had been wronged rather than had done wrong. I eventually stopped expecting a different outcome, and found, to my surprise, that accepting this brought its own kind of peace. Then, on a Saturday in late April, I was working in my backyard. I had started gardening that year, for reasons that felt obvious in retrospect when a truck pulled into my driveway. I looked up. He sat in the cab for a long time before the door opened. When he finally walked toward me, he looked older in a way that had nothing to do with months. Life. Older. The kind of aging that happens when a person stops running from themselves and turns to look at what's been chasing them. We stood about 6 feet apart. Neither of us spoke. Then my father swallowed, looked away, looked back, and said quietly, I owe you an apology. I didn't respond right away. Not to make him wait. Because I genuinely wasn't sure after 20 years, after everything that I would ever hear those words from him. I wanted to make sure I actually heard them. I was wrong. 4 words. No qualification. No pivot. No explanation waiting behind them. Just the truth, standing alone. The wind moved through the trees above us. Birds somewhere nearby. The world very still. I had imagined this moment across years and thousands of miles. I had imagined it would feel enormous, climactic, like the end of a great and dramatic thing. It didn't. It felt quiet, like arriving somewhere after a very long walk and discovering that the destination is simply a place to finally rest. I should have protected you that night. His voice broke on the last word. I watched his face, the lines around his eyes, the exhaustion. The specific kind of grief that belongs only to people who are seeing themselves clearly for the first time, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger. Not the satisfaction I'd told myself I'd feel. Just sorrow. The sorrow of hearing the right words 20 years too late, from a man who could have said them at any point and chose, every single time, not to. You should have, I said. He nodded. And then I need you to understand what this cost him. How impossible this was for a man who had spent his entire life armored in pride. A tear appeared in the corner of his eye. I failed you. The words barely left his lips. And I believed him. Not because he had suddenly become someone different, not because everything was repaired or healed or finished, but because truth was finally standing between us, naked and undefended. And that is the only foundation anything real can be built on. I stepped forward and hugged him. Not because the past disappeared when I did. Not because 20 years of hurt evaporated on contact. I hugged him because I have learned slowly, at great cost, through years of getting this exactly wrong, that carrying hatred forever is just another kind of imprisonment. I had already spent enough years locked up. He pulled back after a moment, cleared his throat in the way men do when they're trying to manage something they weren't built for. And as he walked back to his truck, he paused, turned around, said, "Thank you." The words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, borrowed and unsteady, like someone saying a word in a language they are only just beginning to learn. I watched him drive away, and I stood there in my backyard with soil on my hands and the afternoon light falling sideways through the new leaves, and for the first time since a freezing Thanksgiving night in a driveway I was being thrown out of, I felt completely at peace. I want to be clear about something before I leave you with this story, because I know how it might look from the outside. This was not a revenge story. Not really. Revenge is about hurting someone. What happened here was different. I simply stopped. I stopped carrying people who had stopped seeing me as a person worth carrying. I stopped confusing love with obligation. I stopped believing that family earns unlimited grace regardless of how they treat you. What this story taught me, the thing I wish I had understood 20 years earlier, is that the most loving thing you can do for yourself, and sometimes for the people you love, is to let consequences be honest. Because kindness alone, extended without limit, without reciprocity, without the possibility of consequence, doesn't produce gratitude. It produces entitlement. And entitlement eventually produces a hand across your face at a Thanksgiving table, and a pointed finger at a door, and a room full of people who watch it happen and say nothing. The mistake I made for 2 decades was believing that if I gave enough, I would eventually become visible. I was wrong. People don't see you because you sacrifice. They see you when you stop, when you become visible, not through endless provision, but through the simple, radical act of refusing to disappear. The question I want to leave you with, and I mean this, sit with it genuinely, is this: who in your life have you been invisible for? And what would change if you stopped? Drop a comment and tell me what you think. Type 1 if you believe I made the right call. Type 2 if you can see both sides of this. Type 3 if you think I took it too far. Tell me where in the world you're watching from right now, and what time it is where you are. I read every comment, and I genuinely love knowing where these stories reach. And if this one found you at the right moment, if it touched something you've been carrying, share it. You never know whose day it changes. There are more stories coming. Stories about the quiet kind of courage that doesn't make headlines but changes lives. Subscribe and stay with us, because the story that finds you right when you need it most is always just one more video away. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Denver, Colorado to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.